So today we're going to look at London's World War One War Memorials, focusing on London because, as in 1918, the capital of the empire, that is where a lot of the big commemorations were. But if you go to any town or village in Britain, you will see memorials to the dead of World War One. And let me just get this along to there. We are at the point now where this has gone from being a memory to being history. There are no more survivors of World War One left. The last died 3 or 4 years ago. It is now what, it'll be 103 years this year since the guns fell silent on the 11th of November 1918. The people you can see in these photographs, one of those historical quirks, they are further away from us than they are from the Battle of Waterloo. They are connected more to the 19th century than they are to the 21st century. But it still has this incredible resonance in our consciousness. And even though it has gone from memory, it still retains this sort of fascination, partly because of the brutality of it. In the West, so I'll just move that up to that, so it's not blocking. In the West, it was a war of attrition, of mud, of suffering, of slaughter, many more British casualties in World War One than there were in World War Two. The numbers are terrifying. Whenever you read any book about the history of World War One, the numbers of men killed in these battles almost defies belief. There were over 700,000 British British soldiers killed in World War One. Over 1.5 million wounded, twice as many killed in World War One than there were in World War Two. So a vast slaughter of young men. And again, to put that in some sort of context, since the end of World War Two, there have been about 7,000 British soldiers killed in active service around the world. So in the last 75 years, about 7,000 UK servicemen killed. On the first day of the Somme, the Battle of the Somme, July the 1st, 1916, 19,000 British soldiers were killed just on that one day. There were more British soldiers killed on the morning of the 1st of July 1916 than there have been in all wars that the British have been involved in since World War II. So a staggering death rate, and it affected just about every town, every village, almost every family. There had been war memorials before. These are a couple in London. The one on the right is the memorial, the Guards Memorial for the Crimea War, and the one on the left is by St James's Park. It's a memorial to the Royal Artillery, the deaths in the Royal Artillery in the Boer War at the very end of the 1800s. But the casualties in these pale into insignificance. In both the Boer War and the Crimea War, the British losses, about 22,000. I mean, it's a lot, but remember, go back to that 19,000 killed on the 1st of July 1916. And things were different. Back in the Boer War, in the Crimea War, it was a professional army, an all-volunteer army. What made things different for World War One were the numbers of new people involved in it. When the war broke out in 1914, there were, including reservists, territorials, colonial troops, about 700,000 people in the army. there is that horrible coincidence that there were about 700,000 people in the army in 1914. The fatalities in the army 1914 to 18 were about 700,000. So it was a fairly big army, small compared to the French, small compared to the Germans. It recruited, first of all, by volunteers. 2.5 million men volunteered to fight between 1914 and the introduction of conscription in 1916. Kitchener's army, it was called. Kitchener was the chief of staff, the head of the army. Sorry, if someone could, if you could mute yourself, whoever that was. The famous poster, you know, I want you for the British Army, Kitchener with his wonderful mustache, pointing out of the posters. 2.5 million young men heard that call and signed up, including the gentleman on the left who signed up from Yorkshire pit villages. Henry Milnes, gentleman in the middle, enlisted within a week of the war breaking out. War broke out on the 4th of August. He signed up on the 10th of August, 1914, wounded at Passchendaele, invalided out in February 1918. So saw 3 years of active service and then 6 months of recovery before he was invalided out. And he is my granddad, sat there in the middle. Never would have thought of becoming a soldier, but he applied for the colours. 1 year with the colours, or for the duration they signed up. That duration lasted longer. Overall, 5.5 million young men were either volunteered or conscripted to fight in the war, plus 3 million Empire troops. And as I say, 750,000 deaths overall across the army and the navy. There is a thing called thankful villages, 53 of these around England and Wales. These are parishes who did not lose any men during the war. All the men who went off to the war came back again. Only 53 of these from tens of thousands of parishes across the country. And that shows you how widespread this impact was. There were very few places that did not have victims, who did not lose sons in the battle. And one of the decisions that was taken very early on was that they would not repatriate the bodies. They would not bring them back to bury them in their home graveyards, to bring them back to their families. They would be buried close to where they fell. One of the other decisions was that there was going to be uniformity amongst the gravestones. There were going to be no great sort of mausoleums. It was not going to be a function of what you could pay for to have a commemoration raised to your son or your husband who was killed. What you see here is one of the Commonwealth war graves that is called Tyne Cot. It's the biggest. It is close to where the 3 battles of Ypres took place, the Battle of Passchendaele being the third of those. One of the other big factors was that of these 750,000, over 300,000 had no known grave. They were either unidentified, that their bodies were lost. In some cases, the battlefields were such horrible oceans of mud that if you slipped off one of the duckboards, you could drown in craters and your body would not be found. They are still finding bodies in the farmlands of Belgium. Even 100 years after the war, new bodies are coming up. And in some cases, the destructive power, particularly of the artillery that was constant during the war on the Western Front, would just obliterate the bodies. So you have got this sense that if you have lost someone, they are buried overseas, or their body has never been found. You've got a telegram saying your son, your husband, your father is missing in action. So a tremendous feeling grew back home. There was no place to mourn the dead unless you made the trip across the channel to seek out the grave. You had no place to lay flowers, to grieve over your loved one. And in July 1919, there was a peace parade to celebrate victory, to celebrate the defeat of the Germans. And the French had done a similar one, and they had put up a memorial, and the British government under Lloyd George thought that was an excellent idea. So a couple of weeks before the peace parade was scheduled, the famous architect Edwin Lutyens was asked to design a temporary memorial. It was made of wood and plaster, and this is the temporary memorial that was made. And the government saw this as a focus for commemorating victory, but the public sort of repurposed it. They saw it as something, a place to remember the dead. There are said to have been over 1 million people come to pay their respects to the glorious dead, Lloyd George's phrase that went onto the cenotaph. It was meant to be temporary, it was meant to come down, but this great clamour grew up that it should be made permanent. And within a few weeks, the decision was made that there would be a permanent memorial, and we'll come on to that later. But the original cenotaph is this wood and plaster construction that was meant to be temporary, is devoid of religious symbolism, apart from the obvious Christian one at the top of the empty tomb. You can see at the top, that is the empty tomb. Cenotaph is Greek for the empty tomb. Decorated with flags. Lutyens wanted these to be carved, to be stone, to be marble ones. He's done a memorial to one of the civil service regiments that's at Somerset House, and that has got sculptured flags on it. But again, a decision was made to put up actual flags, and these are regularly changed. After the peace parade, when the crowds had dispersed, people still kept coming back, still kept laying flowers. The analogous situation would have been with the death of Princess Diana back in 1997, when Kensington Gardens became just full of flowers with people paying their respects. A similar thing happened in Whitehall. So the government then fenced it off, made the announcement that a new cenotaph would be built. The old one, by then, as it had only meant to be temporary, was pretty much falling apart and was taken down, and the new one was unveiled in November 1920. But you also see other memorials across London, across the country. This is a church on Clapham Common, Holy Trinity Church, Clapham Common. The War Memorial is the cross that's outside it. It's a very famous church. I include the slide on the right. It's where the Clapham sect met. William Wilberforce, the Britons who agitated for the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. And the plaque that commemorates them is chipped from a World War II bomb that landed quite close to it, and the shrapnel from that has left its mark on that church. In the porch are plaques to that name the dead of the parish killed in the war, and just round the corner, the school that was close by also has a plaque. Again, you see these listings of names. These will predominantly be buried overseas, or if in the case of the naval officers, their bodies may never have been found. And there are names that crop up. If you notice here, you can also just about see it here. 3 brothers, 3 out of 4 brothers killed. The Burleys, Bennett, James and Robert Burley, all of them lieutenants, all of them in different regiments, 3 out of 4 of them killed. And that is not untypical. Families saw multiple deaths. When we come on to the story of the unknown warrior, the guests of honor at the burial, the interment of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey were women who had lost their husbands and all of their sons in the war. And there were over 100 of those who were guests of honor. So churches, you will see that every church, almost every parish green in London and across the country have got commemorations like this. There are memorials from workplaces. These here are just 3 random ones. The Young's Brewery, Liberty, the store in just near Oxford Circus, the men who were lost there, and this one, the Prudential Assurance Memorial. 787 members of or people who'd worked for the Prudential Insurance Company were killed in the war, and their names are commemorated here. These angels, it's this statue by a sculptor called Blunstone, angels carrying the body of a dead soldier up to heaven, presumably. Close by this, it's at a place called Holborn Bars in the centre of London. Close by, just as you enter the boundary of the City of London, there is the memorial to the Fusiliers, the Royal Fusiliers, which is the regiment of the City of London. A soldier said to be based on one of the sergeants within the regiment, sculpted by someone called Albert Toft, 2.5 meters, so what's that, about 9 feet tall, made of bronze on this big Portland stone pedestal. And again, we look at the numbers: 22,000 Royal Fusiliers who fell in the Great War. And on the back of it, there is another phenomenon. The different regiments within that, or rather the different battalions within that regiment. One of the innovations, or one of the things brought in when they were trying to get people to volunteer to fight, was to create what became known as Powell's battalions. These were people who lived together or worked together. So battalions formed from friends within towns. So particularly in some of the northern industrial towns, the battalions were recruited together and served together. Within the City of London, you have got battalions formed of stockbrokers, people who worked in the stockbroking firms. There were 1,600 of those initially who volunteered. The 26th Battalion, the bankers, people who worked for the banks in the City of London. In all, 2,700 served in that battalion. 700, over a quarter of them, were killed. And this happened across a lot of the northern cities as well, where you have battalions formed of people who lived and worked together, and generations of young men were killed, particularly on the first day of the Somme. Something like the Accrington Powells, which became a famous play in the 1960s, lost a huge proportion of their young men because they had all enlisted together, trained together. they then went into active service together and were killed together. So towns were suffering much more than they did in the Second War because of this recruitment policy of trying to keep people who knew each other together. And that is borne out again on the back of this. You have got people recruited from East Ham, from East London, the Kensington Battalion, sportsmen's battalions, people who had been to public schools or universities would join up a specific battalion so that they could be amongst people that they knew. And the consequences of this were dire for if those particular battalions were engaged in some of the major conflicts. You also have within London memorials to other specific regiments. So we've looked at the Fusiliers over here. At Hyde Park Corner, the traffic island as it is in Hyde Park Corner, there is the Wellington Arch there. It's close to Apsley House at top of Piccadilly. There is a collection of memorials. There are the memorials to the Australians who fell in World War I and World War II, and New Zealanders who fell in World War I and II. This is a memorial to the Machine Gun Corps. 170,000 people in the Corps at some point, 14,000 of those were killed, over 50,000 wounded. It's by a sculptor called Francis Derwent Wood, and it seems quite unusual. It is David, this young man. It is created to model the human form, and it seems somehow out of place with commemorating battles. Where are the soldiers? Where are the wounded on this? Why is it David? There are a couple of reasons behind this. Derwent Wood was involved in a very early medical arrangement where soldiers who were disfigured were given prosthetics to try and counter some of this disfigurement. It became known as the Tin Noses Shop, and Derwent Wood was an important part of this. And it's thought that he may have used this sort of perfect human form to acknowledge the destruction and the dismemberment that had happened to that. To a lot of the young men who fought. So it wasn't just the young men being killed. A lot of these came back with hugely disfiguring wounds. The other is, it comes from the quote. It comes from the Bible. There is a couple of Vickers machine guns on them. There is a story that is not proved either way that those are actual Vickers machine guns that have been bronzed, and the bronze laurels put around them. We don't know for certain whether that is, but on the base, on the pedestal, there is the quote, "Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands." And that is quite, it's possibly the most chilling quote on any war memorial. It shows you the level of destruction and the level of destruction that this new automated war was bringing. It was a war where the defense had the advantage, artillery at all times, but you were attacking across mines, across barbed wire, and into the face of not only soldiers with rifles, but machine guns, which could slay their tens of thousands. And again, at the Battle of the Somme, it was thought that the huge bombardment that had gone on before had destroyed the mines, had destroyed the barbed wire, and had blown the German defences away. So in places, the British troops were ordered to walk across no man's land, not charge across it, walk across it. The German defenders had taken shelter when the bombardment took place. Once that stopped, they came out, they set up their machine guns, and they opened fire. There are stories from the Germans of their machine guns overheating. They are firing so many bullets at these troops walking across no man's land into the bullets that are being fired against them. So you have got a war that is, defense is vastly superior. It is only later in the war, when the tactics improve, when new weapons such as the tanks come in, that an advantage switches to the offensive. But for 3 years, battles took place over no man's land, land given, land taken, thousands killed to gain hundreds of yards of territory, thousands lost when that territory was ceded again. And this war of attrition worked its way into the consciousness of everybody. The other big factor in the war was the artillery. And just by Derwentwood's machine gun corps memorial is this incredible war memorial. It's an absolutely immense work in all senses of the word. It is modelled on a 9.2 inch howitzer used by the British Royal Regiment of Artillery, a great huge gun that could deliver devastation. You have to think, in some of these bombardments prior to offensive, millions, literally millions of shells were fired on the opposing forwards. Shrapnel, so it isn't just the great explosion, shells designed to explode above the trenches, to shower hot metal down onto the troops in the trenches beneath. This is a work by an artist called Charles Sergeant Jagger, who had served. He was a captain. He won the Military Cross for bravery. He had served in a battalion called the Artists' Rifles. So again, another of these Powell's battalions, creative people who had signed up together to fight together. And the Artists' Rifles are a famous one of those, predominantly recruited from London. Unveiled in 1925, Portland stone again, the great imperial stone that is used on imperial buildings throughout London, and these bronze figures around it, larger than life size. There is one on each of the faces of the memorial, a carrier, a driver driving horses, because a lot of certainly in the early part of the war, the guns were moved by horses, and an officer with his greatcoat there. And the contentious one is on the face that faces Hyde Park, and it is the body of a dead soldier. There was a lot of resistance to this. The people, certainly the commissioners, the people who commissioned the monument, did not want to have the representation of death on there, but Jagger insisted. He even said that he would pay for this bronze to be cast if the commissioners did not want it. Around it, there's a quote from Henry V's. Here was a royal fellowship of death, and the artillery regiments suffered again hugely within within the conflict. Over 70,000 from the regiment, commemorated in a roll of honour that is buried underneath this work here. And the more one looks at it, there is not just those huge bronze sculptures, but there are the reliefs, the friezes that run around it, including these sort of things that Jagger would have seen himself as a serving soldier. people carrying their fallen comrades along, someone dressed in a sheepskin or a fur jacket against the cold, as a spotter is receiving along the wires details of how accurate the firing would be. And you look at the bronzes cast of that dead soldier that's lying there, the boots with the nails in them, the hands frozen in death, but now frozen in bronze, modeled in clay to begin with and then cast, and also hidden on one corner of the memorial is perhaps for Christians a sign of hope. There is, it represents an image through a window of a destroyed church or a destroyed building. You have got Christ and the Virgin Mary being able to be seen through this window, and flowers in a vase, showing from all of this destruction that perhaps there is hope, that perhaps life will come again to it. Jagger was also responsible for this wonderful piece, which is at Paddington Station. This was slightly earlier, 1922, Letters from Home. And it's another memorial that commemorates men who belong to a particular company, in this case, the Great Western Railway. Their names are recorded around this statue, and that is still there at Paddington Station. So that brings us back to the cenotaph. Oh, sorry, on the way we pass through. This is a much later war memorial. This was unveiled in 2002 and commemorates common soldiers from the British Empire who did not have a memorial up until then, in both World War I and World War II. So from Africa, the Caribbean, the Indian subcontinent, across those two wars, about 5 million of what were known as colonial troops or empire troops served. 23 Victoria Crosses were awarded to some of those colonial troops during World War I, and they're in this little canopy that is just there at the top of Constitution Hill as one goes down. So it is an afterthought, as so much with the British Empire. We have only commemorated the brave men who served from the empire within London substantially after the war ended. As I say, 2002, this was unveiled. But back to the cenotaph, there in Whitehall. This is the cenotaph that was unveiled in November 1920, Armistice Day, 11th of November 1920, and it is still the site for national commemoration of the dead of all wars that takes place on Remembrance Sunday each year, the second Sunday in November. The file past of the march past rather of veterans. These days, no World War I veterans, fewer and fewer World War II veterans who are able to make it, but veterans of subsequent conflicts do file past. The royal family, politicians, visiting, ambassadors, lay poppy wreaths around it, and then there is the 2-minute silence that takes place at 11 o'clock. This came about, as I said earlier, from that initial plaster and wood. This was remade for the following year based on the same design by Lutyens in Portland stone. The only differences being that rather than having actual laurel wreaths, there are sculptures of laurel wreaths. Those were also done by Derwent Wood, the same sculptor who cast that bronze of David on the Machine Gun Corps Memorial. And again, the flowers piled up. Probably about 1 million visitors came to this after its unveiling. It was unveiled, as I say, on the 11th of November 1920, unveiled by the King, George V, and this is there just at the unveiling. The other thing that happened on that day was the interment of the body of the unknown warrior. This came from a thought that had come about, an idea by a padre, a priest who was working with British forces. He had seen written on a simple wooden cross an unknown soldier, and he thought and then spoke to the Dean of Westminster Abbey that perhaps there should be some national commemoration like this, that an unknown soldier should be buried in Westminster Abbey, and Westminster Abbey is where it's the national mausoleum. There are nearly 3,500 memorials to the great and the good within Westminster Abbey. And that could act as a focus for national grief. It would be a place where people who had lost loved ones could come and pay their respects and lay flowers. It would also signify, it would also be a place where the country could give honor and praise to the people who had fallen. And it was controversial, but again, the government got behind it. The King was persuaded to do it. So in early November 1920, 4 bodies of unknown soldiers were exhumed over in France, one from the Somme, one from near Arras, one from near Ypres, and one from the front near Aisne. They were put into a room, and the leading general went in blindfolded and indicated one of them. That became the unknown warrior. The other 3 were reburied with full military honors, but the one selected was put into a coffin that had been made from oak that had been taken from a tree in the grounds of Hampton Court Palace. A crusader's sword was taken from the armory in the Tower of London and buried within it. The body was then taken to Boulogne, a procession 2 miles long with people paying their respects and with the French military giving full honors, put onto a destroyer, brought to Dover, put onto a special train that came from Dover up to Victoria Station. They painted the roof of the carriage that the coffin was in. They painted that white so that people could throw flowers onto it from the bridges as they passed, and people did. The train moved slowly through the Kent countryside, and thousands turned out to pay their respects, to either bow their heads or gather on the bridges to throw flowers as this passed through. It was then put onto a gun carriage, brought round to the unveiling of the cenotaph, and then a guard of honor of 100 men with VCs, and followed by the chiefs of staff, by the King, by the Prince of Wales, who you can see here, followed that gun carriage through into Westminster Abbey and buried very close to the western entrance. So it's taken in through the northern door, as I say, a guard of honor of 100 men who had won the Victoria Cross. The guests of honor at the interment included over 100 women who had lost their husbands and all of their sons in the conflict. And it is buried in soil that had been brought over, sacks of soil from the battlefields of France, and a stone of Belgian marble was cast above it. And it is still there. It is there, and it is the one place within Westminster Abbey that no one ever walks on. It is right by the entrance of the west door, but any services, royal weddings, funerals, commemorations go around the unknown warrior. If there is a state visit, the visiting head of state will come and lay a wreath and pay their respects to the unknown warrior. If there is a royal wedding, the flowers are sent back, the bouquet of the bride is sent back and is put on this grave, and that goes back to the wedding of the Queen Mother, the present Queen's mother, when she married the future George VI. As she left the church, she left her bouquet on the grave of the unknown warrior because she had lost her brother in the First World War, and that has become the tradition. So every royal wedding since, the flowers are sent back and put on the grave. And the text you can see there in front of you is the text, the words composed by the Dean of Westminster Abbey, Dean Ryle. They buried him among the kings. They buried him in the great national mausoleum. This set a template. At the same time, a unknown warrior was being buried in Paris, and the unknown soldier in Arlington Cemetery was buried the next year. The unknown warrior was made an honorary Victoria Cross. The unknown soldier in Arlington is an honorary Victoria Cross. The unknown warrior is an honorary Congressional Medal of Honor. And you can see that medal within Westminster Abbey when you go. So that's it for the talk. I'll leave you on the national celebration. As I say, I hope to do this once summer arrives, once lockdown ends, once it's completely safe to do so. As a walk, we will gather at Hyde Park Corner near the Royal Artillery Memorial, go down Constitution Hill and see some of the other memorials, through to the cenotaph, and more details of that later on in the year. But don't forget, coming up in the next couple of weeks, we've got more UK Tours Online stuff coming along.